Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on the philosophy of constructivism and science as education. This is by Carter Lee, Stanton Tai, and me, Devin Abraham. Let's get into it. What comes to mind when you think of a modern science class? It could be long lectures where you're constantly being fed material and you're trying to wrap your head around all these ideas being thrown at you. It could be overpriced textbooks where you need the newest edition to answer a few questions and kind of help you polish your studying up a little bit. Or it could kind of be straightforward labs where everyone kind of gets the same result. You're not really arguing with others. You just get your results and it somewhat reflects on what you learned about. All of these have in common is that they are acquisition learning. Acquisition refers to the first stages of learning when a response is established. The problem with this is that it lacks critical thinking skills associated with the nature of science. It's kind of just being fed information without really getting meaning out of it. And along with this, it lacks communication as students are not really debating with each other or reasoning with the results. They're kind of just getting the information and studying it for the test. Finally, the problem with acquisition learning is that it lacks engagement. Sitting in a lecture hall where the teacher is just rambling on about science facts is not the most engaging, as you are kind of just being fed facts without really getting to know it. But I will say that science labs are kind of in a gray area for acquisition learning. They can be more out of it, but most labs within junior high to high school kind of don't really bring in the scientific method that we would see in universities. So it's somewhat acquisition learning. This leads me into scientific method. Practicing science is a complex process where individuals need to come up with hypotheses and then debate/collaborate with others to try and reinforce these explanations for how the world around us works. However, as we just discussed, current science education tends to take a very simplistic approach, which does not encourage discovery and direct engagement with the topic. This is demonstrated, as we talked about, through acquisition learning, where the material is primarily learned through textbooks or lecture slides, without students discovering much on their own. But this is the difference we see in actual scientific thinking, where a scientific scholar would first observe something, question it, formulate a hypothesis, which leads into experimenting, which could go wrong, where they have to go back to an observation or question and redesign their hypothesis maybe, or it could lead into a conclusion, which leads into a result, and debates between other scientists and forming the results. And this all cycles back into leading a new observation. And this is kind of the scientific method we see in universities, which doesn't really take place a lot in junior high, high school science, where students are kind of just fed information rather than really getting to experience this phenomena. This leads me into the problem of practice. While acquisition learning is still useful for many of the topics in education, especially science, it's still useful. It may not be the best method for teaching students how to think like scientists. This leads to the problem of solely focusing on acquisition learning may not be the best approach to teaching science education. What this means is kind of that students may excel at acquisition learning and be really good at test taking and getting those notes down and just getting their understanding like that. But will that truly help students to think or question as a scientific scholar would? That's what we're going to kind of get into in this presentation. Some quotes that kind of back this up is conventional pedagogical practices of teaching emphasize learning of answers more than exploration of questions. So as I was saying, more so you're getting taught these facts and just remembering for the test rather than looking at how these facts came to be, how this knowledge came to be, and really questioning as science is really centered around. Another quote that really emphasizes this point is the role of a science educator is to mediate scientific knowledge for learners, to help them to make personal sense of the ways in which knowledge claims are generated and validated, rather than to organize individual sense-making about the natural world. So really getting to think how scientists think in formulating questions and theories and looking into that rather than just being fed information. This leads me to the theory of constructivism, which is the primary focus of our presentation. Constructivism is a theory of philosophy with multiple meanings in different perspectives. Coburn highlights constructivism as a theory about how people learn and more often represents an array of teaching strategy. What this means in plain terms is constructivism in education is a theory where students construct knowledge based on personal experiences and reflect upon these experiences. Constructivism differs from acquisition for learners, as instead of trying to memorize something, they must actively try a concept out and reflect on it. To accomplish this, students must tie new concepts to things they already know, building upon previous knowledge. So let's watch a short vid, if it comes up, about the Simpsons idea of constructivism.
You must be Bart Simpson. I'm Ms. Milan, your learning coordinator. Let me say right at the start that we have one rule here. Make your own rules. If you feel sleepy, take a nap. If you get bored, feel free to take out a book and start reading.
What should I read, ma'am?
Why, anything you want, Bart.
Oh.
A comic book? When we left off, Calvin and Tanya were arguing that free will is an illusion.
If you ask me, humankind has freedom, but a freedom fraught with paradoxes. Freud shows how childhood shapes our subconscious mind, but this helps us to think for ourselves.
Well, this is a more exaggerated version of constructivism, as a teacher wouldn't really just say, oh, student, you can go to sleep now, or you can do whatever you want. It kind of shows the main idea of constructivism in letting the students kind of guide their own learning and really reflecting upon what they know. As we see in the end of the video, the students discussing free will, and this is a great way for building upon knowledge as you discuss with others and reflect upon your own learnings, which is the whole idea of constructivism. Now let's look at some of the constructivist / socio-constructivist approaches to teaching. First, we look at freedom, where students kind of get to decide their own path or studies or what they want to get into. While in a regular classroom, it's going to have to tie into the program of studies. There's still some freedom that you can give students to really research on their own and come up to their own conclusions. In constructivist teaching, it's more hands-on, so we see a lot of labs and finding of the information for students themselves, interpreting the data on their own rather than just being told what the data is. Self-directed learning, again, more so students coming up to the conclusions themselves. Cooperative learning, where students discuss with others, discuss their results, debate with each other, come to conclusions. That's more the socio-constructivist approach. Scaffolding, so as we said, building upon ideas, this kind of theory of constructivist, building upon previous knowledge to get to an ultimate bigger idea, which is a big concept in science, building upon your previous knowledge. And finally, guided inquiry. And this is a big one for teachers, as they must apply themselves when using a constructivist approach in teaching. And while it might seem that constructivism is a way for teachers to be lazy and let students do all the learnings themselves, couldn't be further from the reality. With constructivism, teachers are required to plan activities extensively and methodically, also being patient in guiding students where to find the answers without being too direct. Students in constructivist classrooms are actively making meaning out of the material. This is a big point of constructivist teaching. Finally, I just wanted to quickly talk about how constructivism ties in with the TQS. So it is important for the engaging in career-long learning as you are supporting all students through the process. No questions, no answers are wrong. You let students explore and discover on their own, and you can kind of guide them in the right way. You reflect upon your teaching and you kind of make it so it connects and it best suits your students. You demonstrate a professional body of knowledge. So planning and designing learning activities that link the activity and the intended learner outcomes. You are building student capacity for collaboration, kind of this socio-constructivist approach. And you consider all student variables by how you design labs for students to, or even assignments for students, how they want to engage with the content. You look at all different levels. And finally, using instructional strategies to engage students in meaningful learning activities based on understanding students' prior knowledge and experience, scaffolding, as we talked about, and a knowledge of how students develop as learners. So all this ties into the inquiry question, what we are going to be looking at and answering through this presentation. And this inquiry question is, how can constructivism be pragmatically applied in modern classrooms to improve students' understanding of science? So let us look at that.
Significance and reasoning. Before we delve into how constructivism can be applied to modern science classrooms, we first must highlight why constructivism needs to be implemented into the contemporary classroom setting. In other words, we need to explore a query of, why does this inquiry question matter? Why do we care? Well, constructivist teaching has been demonstrated to foster critical thinking, as well as create more active and motivated learners. A study by Zemmelman, Daniels, and Hyde argued that learning in all subject areas involves the construction and reformulation of new and previously existing ideas. The study further notes that incorporating constructivist theories into the classroom allows for educators to create classroom environments where students are able to construct their own understandings of scientific concepts, rather than memorizing rote facts and formulas. Vosnot also suggested that a constructivist approach to teaching science can be used to create learners who are autonomous, inquisitive thinkers who question, investigate, and reason. By transitioning from a traditional curriculum wherein teachers transmit information to students who passively listen and acquire facts, to a transformational sort of curriculum wherein students are actively involved in constructing their own learning to reach new understandings, students are given the opportunity to self-recognize how and why scientifically accepted explanations explain and predict what will happen in a given situation better than their intuitive ideas. In constructivist classrooms, the environment is democratic, the activities are interactive and student-centered, and the students are empowered by a teacher who operates as a facilitator or consultant rather than as an authoritative lecturer. To that end, it's clear that constructivism, at least in theory, would be a valuable pedagogical addition to a modern science classroom. However, as mentioned in Driver et al., a significant issue among science educators is the relationship between constructivist views of teaching and learning and the actual implications of that pedagogy in the classroom. The paper further argues that particular views of teaching and learning do not necessarily entail specific pedagogical practices. In other words, there exists vast amounts of research surrounding the proposed value of constructivism, but less research surrounding the pragmatic articulation of constructivist approaches to pedagogy in science classrooms. To that end, our inquiry question addresses that pragmatic aspect of constructivism and attempts to outline practical means of inserting constructivist practices in modern science classrooms. From the viewpoint of constructivist learning theory, science teaching involves trying to help students change their beliefs to be more in line with those generally held by the scientific community. Teaching then is about helping students understand why and how scientifically accepted explanations explain and predict what will happen in a given situation better than their intuitive ideas. To that end, Applying constructivist learning theory generally involves the following 3-point framework. The instructor or educator needs to first needs to ensure that the students are clear in their understanding of their own ideas. For instance, if a student believed in the astrological model of heliocentrism, it would then be important for the instructor to not correct the student, but rather to ensure that the student understands why he believes in that scientific perspective. Secondly, the educator would need to help students understand the underlying scientific issues or problems associated with their current beliefs, if there are any. And finally, the educator would need to present alternate beliefs that address the scientific gaps in the student's previous beliefs and that ultimately make more sense to the student after some personal consideration. Alan Colburn, a science education researcher, has previously provided a few recommendations and strategies on pragmatically implementing constructivism in modern science classrooms. Here, we will go through a few of those recommendations. Utilizing cooperative learning. From a constructivist viewpoint, cooperative learning activities hold a significant amount of educational value. Cooperative learning is inherently valuable as it allows students to talk with each other about their scientific ideas and beliefs. Sometimes, having students explain their viewpoints to other students is enough to cause those learners to see problems with their initial explanations. Other times, students can ask challenging questions or present alternate viewpoints amongst each other. Challenging questions help people understand the flaws in their ideas, and if the questions come from peers, they may be seen as less threatening than if they came from a teacher per se. In other words, cooperative learning activities and collaborative student discussion allow for students to naturally construct and refine their own understandings of certain scientific concepts. Classroom demonstrations. Interactive and empirical classroom demonstrations are another pragmatic means of applying constructivist principles to a modern classroom setting. With that being said, though, from the constructivist perspective, classroom demonstrations work best when they encourage students to think about their preconceived scientific ideas and then subsequently challenge those ideas. Two types of demonstrations are particularly noteworthy. The first is utilizing what is known as a discrepant event. In a discrepant event, the students or the actual empirical results are meant to be different from those initially expected by many of the students. An example of a discrepant event from physics instruction would be to drop a styrofoam on a steel ball of equal volumes from the same height, same time, and note that they actually both hit the floor at the exact same time. Here, students are challenged to scientifically explain what they see, and their original thinking is directly challenged. Alternatively to discrepant events, instructors could also use predictions. When the teacher asks students to make predictions about what will happen, before the classroom demonstration takes place, it forces students to access their previous knowledge and develop their own understandings of what is expected to occur. Seeing whether their predictions are accurate is a way for students to test their understandings and then subsequently refine those understandings if they happen to be inaccurate. In addition, the teacher can also ask students guiding questions such as, why do you think that will happen? In that way, the teacher gets a better understanding of how some of those students understand the phenomena in question and can subsequently address those gaps in the students' scientific understandings. Finally, we have utilizing open-ended, hands-on activities. The National Science Education Standards suggested that integrating constructivist tenets into modern science classroom involves hands-on activities, but more specifically, involves activities that are neither linear nor confirmation-style laboratories. If students are simply following set procedures, they are not required to use or test previous knowledge. Their ideas are therefore not challenged. Rather, pragmatically implementing constructivism involves creating classroom environments where students are occasionally engaged in open-ended activities where they must use their previous scientific knowledge to answer questions. In doing so, they will sometimes begin to see flaws in their thinking and be more ready for alternative explanations. effectively allowing for students to gradually construct their own understandings of certain scientific concepts. Open-ended activities also give teachers greater opportunities to speak to students, ask questions, and better understand for students intuitive scientific ideas.
Now, how can we apply constructivism in classrooms to improve students' understanding of science? First and foremost, we need to consider open-ended activities that are not direct transfers of information. As a guiding tool to achieve this, we can look at the 5E instructional model. Although educators and teachers may feel uncomfortable teaching in this manner, using templates can help them achieve a more constructivist classroom. The 5E instructional model. What is the 5E instructional model? According to Duran and Duran, the 5E instructional model, in essence, is a constructivist model of teaching. The 5E instructional model can be used as the guideline for a sequence of lessons, units, or even as the basis for a yearly plan. Since constructivist theory is, in plain terms, the construction of knowledge by students based on personal experiences, the 5E instructional model targets this manner of teaching. The basics of the 5E instructional model is that it involves 5 steps in the cycle: engagement, exploration, elaboration, and evaluation. Outlined by Duran and Duran, the engagement step is designed to evoke curiosity within students, creating a desire to learn more about a concept or issue. Next, the exploration step allows students to develop common foundational knowledge about a concept or issue. The explanation step involves students explaining their understanding, where the teacher may assist in facilitating this discussion, as well as clarifying student misconceptions. As the constructivist theory revolves around the student constructing their own knowledge, the elaboration step encourages students to apply what they had previously engaged in during the previous steps of the 5E instructional model and apply it to their prior experiences to reinforce their new knowledge. Finally, according to Duran and Duran, the evaluation step involves the formal and informal assessment of students' learning throughout the cycle. Now, for examples of the usage of this model for applying constructivist theory into classrooms. Now that we know the basics of the constructivist model teaching, how has this been applied? In a study by Dogru and Callender in 2007, 2 grade 6 classrooms learning about a cell were compared against each other. One was taught with a constructivist approach, while the other was taught with a traditional approach. In the grade 6 classroom taught with a constructivist approach, the 5E instructional model was used. According to Dogru and Callender, at the beginning of the unit, to incite engagement from students, the teacher brought a model of a cell into the classroom and asked students about what it could be. After students identified that the model was a cell and that cells exist in everything, the teacher followed up the lesson by taking students into a lab to examine an epithelium cell and an onion membrane cell. This exploration step enabled students to develop the common understanding of what a cell was, which was followed by the explanation step to clarify misconceptions the students may have had. Following this, the teacher assigned projects that encouraged students to discuss amongst their peers. As part of the elaboration step, the project allowed students to develop and demonstrate their understanding. Finally, the evaluation step was assessed by letting students fill in a concept map. According to Dogru and Callender, the demonstration of the application of constructivism in the classroom produced significant positive results. Back to our inquiry question. The inquiry question presented was as follows: how can constructivism be pragmatically applied in modern classrooms to improve students' understanding of science? By understanding the answer to this question, it will ultimately help shape our future teaching practices. First and foremost, understanding what constructivism is will allow us as future educators to be more personable. Science learning involves personal and social processes, according to Driver et al. Constructivist theory is about students constructing knowledge, and it can serve as the mediator between scientific knowledge with the personal experiences of students. By making connections to students' previous knowledge, it enables mean making. The concepts of science will be more important for the students. Although the construction of their knowledge may oppose students' current conceptions, Driver et al. Describes scientific learning as conceptual change. By applying a constructivist approach to teaching, students are not being forced to change their conceptions. Rather, they discover their misconceptions and therefore improve their understanding of science. Ultimately, to pragmatically apply constructivism in classrooms, the 5E instructional model can be used as a guideline for teachers. The 5E instructional model is a basis for constructivist, inquiry-based teaching, and therefore is an effective methodology on how we, as future educators, can apply constructivism in modern classrooms to improve students' understanding of science. According to Lorsbach and Tobin, although students may be confused at a constructivist approach in an environment of teaching, it will ultimately educate students to be more effective learners. Ultimately, teaching science with a constructivist approach begins to make the classroom environment more like the environment scientists are in. The science that scientists are doing. Science ultimately becomes active learning in these cases, where students construct their own knowledge.